Ah, so you finally stopped turning the key. Welcome back, you quiet disruptor. You didn't kick the door down. You didn't sound alarms. You didn't march in demanding justice or applause. You did something far more unsettling. You stepped out of the pattern. For years, they thought they understood you. Not because you were loud, but because you were consistent, predictable, reliable in your reactions. When pressure was applied, you responded. When tension rose, you engaged. When something needed emotional energy, you supplied it. That predictability made you useful. And every structured system, corporate, social, relational, institutional, leans on one silent assumption: that you will continue behaving the way you always have, that you will keep reacting on cue, keep explaining yourself, keep trying to smooth over friction, keep playing the part assigned to you. You didn't rebel. You recalibrated. One day, without announcement, you stopped feeding the mechanism. No dramatic speech, no emotional exit, no public declaration of transformation. You simply became still. You withdrew your automatic responses. You stopped over-explaining. You stopped defending yourself against narratives you didn't create. You stopped volunteering emotional labor where it was never reciprocated. And that's when something cracked. At first, it was subtle. A strange quiet where there used to be tension. Conversations that didn't escalate the way they normally would. Attempts to provoke that landed on nothing. They assumed you were tired. They assumed it was temporary. They assumed you'd snap back into your old rhythm you always had before. But this time was different, because this time you didn't pause out of exhaustion. You paused out of clarity. You started noticing how much of your energy was circulating through spaces that never intended to nourish you. How often you were reacting instead of choosing. How many expectations you were meeting that you never consciously agreed to carry. You saw the cost, and once you see the cost clearly, you can't pretend it's small. The structure didn't collapse immediately. Systems rarely do. They adjust first, they test, they apply gentle pressure. Curiosity disguised as concern, nostalgia disguised as care. Subtle attempts to pull you back into responsiveness. Are you okay? You seem different. One, miss the old you. What they meant was, you're not behaving in ways that are convenient for us anymore. But you didn't argue. You didn't justify. You didn't overcorrect. You simply remained unavailable to manipulation. And that's when the discomfort began. Because resistance can be handled. Resistance confirms the system is still engaged. If you fight, they can fight back. If you argue, they can counter. If you defend, they can attack. But silence. Silence exposes dependence. You removed your emotional fingerprints from places that relied on them. And suddenly the machinery felt unstable. Not broken, just hollow. That hollow space revealed something uncomfortable. A lot of their influence depended on your participation. Authority feels powerful when people respond automatically, when they explain themselves, when they seek validation, when they chase approval, when they rush to fix misunderstandings. You stopped doing that. You slowed down. You chose your responses. You stopped mistaking urgency for importance. You stopped equating visibility with value, and something unexpected happened. Your world didn't shrink. It clarified. Without constant reaction, you had room to observe. Without the need to be understood, you gained precision. Without defending your choices, you strengthened them internally. You didn't withdraw in bitterness. You withdrew in alignment. That's what unsettled them most. You weren't angry. You weren't chaotic. You weren't broadcasting a new identity. You were calm. Calm is dangerous to systems built on emotional noise, because noise is leverage. Chaos is leverage. Reaction is leverage. Composure is not. They tried interpreting your shift through their old frameworks. Maybe you were going through something. Maybe you were hurt. Maybe you were trying to make a point. But you weren't performing absence. You were reclaiming presence. You realized something quietly radical. Not everything deserves access to you. Not every expectation deserves compliance. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. And you stopped participating in dynamics that required you to shrink. That's when things began to glitch. Conversations lost their usual momentum. Pressure tactics didn't land. Emotional hooks found nothing to latch onto. You became harder to read, not because you were hiding, but because you were no longer reacting from scripts they memorized. And here's the part they're starting to understand, even if they won't say it out loud. You didn't expose them by attacking the structure. You exposed it by stepping outside of it. When you stopped responding predictably, you revealed how much predictability was the foundation. And now they're uneasy, because what took years, billions, and layers of control to reinforce depends on one simple thing: participation. And you just withdrew yours. Here's what they didn't anticipate. They thought your silence would weaken you. That stepping back would make you irrelevant. That without constant visibility, you'd fade into the background and eventually crawl back to regain footing. But something opposite happened. You became sharper. When you stopped reacting automatically, you started seeing patterns you'd missed before. The repetition, the emotional triggers, the carefully timed pressure, the way urgency was manufactured, the way narratives were shaped before facts were even discussed. You realized how much of the structure ran on momentum. Momentum built from habit. Habit built from expectation. Expectation built from predictability. And you broke predictability. That's what shook them. Because systems that cost billions to engineer, social systems, digital systems, corporate hierarchies, psychological frameworks, aren't just built with money. They're built with behavioral forecasting. They rely on modeling how people respond under pressure. They depend on anticipation. And you became unanticipatable, not reckless, not erratic, just self-directed. Pressure came. You didn't tense. Silence came. You didn't fill it. Provocation came. You didn't rise to it. You observed. Observation is a form of power most people underestimate. When you observe instead of react, you collect data. You start noticing who only speaks when it benefits them, who frames questions to control the narrative, who becomes uncomfortable when they can't predict your emotional state. You started noticing who needed you reactive. That realization changed everything. Because once you understand that some authority only works when you're emotionally entangled, detachment becomes liberation. You didn't need to expose secrets. You didn't need to publish evidence. You didn't need to argue philosophy. Your non-participation was enough. When you stopped reinforcing the dynamic, the cracks became visible, not to everyone, but to those paying attention. Conversations that once felt structured started feeling strained. The usual tactics, guilt, urgency, flattery, implied consequences, lost their precision. It's difficult to manipulate someone who isn't chasing approval or fearing exclusion. And that's what unsettled them. You weren't trying to win. You weren't trying to dominate. You weren't trying to overthrow anything. You were simply no longer available. There's something deeply destabilizing about a person who can't be rushed, baited, or pressured. Because urgency is currency in control systems. Respond now. Decide now. Clarify now. Fix this now. You stopped accepting false deadlines. You started asking yourself quiet questions instead. Is this actually important? Is this aligned with me? Is this worth my energy? And when the answer was no, you disengaged without explanation. That's when they started scrambling, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. They replayed your behavior. They searched for the pivot point. They tried to identify the trigger. But there wasn't a single explosive moment. There was a gradual awakening. You realized that influence often isn't loud. It's invisible reinforcement. It's subtle pressure applied repeatedly until compliance feels natural. It's repetition until obedience becomes habit. And you stepped out of habit. You stopped equating attention with importance. You stopped mistaking access for intimacy. You stopped confusing participation with value. That clarity made you difficult to categorize. You weren't opposing them. You weren't supporting them. You were independent of them. Independence is destabilizing in environments built on dependency. They couldn't call you rebellious. They couldn't call you broken. They couldn't frame you as hostile. You were calm. And calm disrupts narratives, because narratives rely on extremes, hero or villain, loyal or defiant, engaged or absent. You became something else, selective. That's when the deeper panic began. Not because you attacked the system, but because your detachment exposed its fragility. If one person could quietly reclaim their autonomy without collapsing, what would happen if others noticed? If others realized they could opt out emotionally, if others understood that control dissolves without reaction, if others saw that peace is possible without permission. You didn't preach this. You embodied it, and embodiment spreads without announcement. People started sensing something different about you. Not louder, not colder, just less available to pressure, less responsive to emotional bait, less concerned with being understood by those who never tried to understand you. You weren't unreachable. You were self-governed. That's the shift they can't measure, because self-governed individuals don't require constant validation. They don't chase positioning. They don't negotiate boundaries endlessly. They don't panic when misunderstood. They decide. They move. They remain steady. And steady people are difficult to destabilize. You didn't expose what they built by attacking its foundation. You exposed it by showing it wasn't your foundation anymore. And now they're left with something they can't control. A version of you that no longer needs the system to feel complete. And here's the part that truly unsettles them. You didn't just step away. You became untethered. Not disconnected from reality, not detached from responsibility, untethered from the psychological hooks that once kept you cycling through the same loops, the same arguments, the same defensive explanations, the same silent negotiations for acceptance. You closed the loop internally. That's what makes this irreversible. Most people who withdraw eventually drift back. Habit pulls them. Familiarity seduces them. The gravity of approval brings them home to the same dynamics, just with new language and slightly firmer boundaries. That's what everyone expected from you. A pause, a reset, a temporary shift, then reintegration. But you didn't reintegrate, because this wasn't burnout, it was awareness. You saw clearly that staying engaged in certain structures required daily micro-betrayals, small compromises, tiny distortions of self. Nothing dramatic enough to justify outrage, but frequent enough to erode alignment. Once you saw that pattern, you couldn't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, participation feels dishonest. So you stopped negotiating with environments that required you to shrink in order to fit. You didn't leave loudly. You didn't demand acknowledgement. You didn't wait for agreement. You simply adjusted your availability, and something profound happened. When pressure was applied, there was no longer anything to grip, no guilt to weaponize, no urgency to trigger, no insecurity to exploit, just composure. That composure exposed something that cost them billions to engineers, the illusion that control is inherent. It's not. It's cooperative. Authority without participation is just noise. Influence without attention dissolves. Power without belief collapses. You didn't need to dismantle anything externally. You withdrew belief. And belief is the most expensive currency in any system. That's why they're unsettled. Because you didn't attack the narrative. You stepped outside it. You didn't challenge authority directly. You stopped recognizing it where it lacked integrity. You didn't try to prove them wrong. You stopped needing them to be right. That kind of autonomy doesn't look aggressive. It looks quiet. It looks like someone who can sit in silence without discomfort. Someone who can be misunderstood without scrambling to correct it. Someone who can be excluded without feeling erased. That's a level of internal stability most systems don't prepare for. They prepare for rebellion. They prepare for outrage. They prepare for compliance. They don't prepare for self-possession. Now, when conversations circle back to you, they don't land cleanly. Your name carries ambiguity. Your absence creates friction. Old tactics don't resolve anything the way they used to, because the version of you they memorized no longer exists. You don't over-explain. You don't overreact. You don't overextend. You choose. That choice, made repeatedly, quietly, reshaped your reality. Your world didn't become louder. It became more precise. Relationships became fewer but stronger. Commitments became deliberate. Your time stopped leaking into spaces that never replenished it. You didn't become colder. You became contained. Containment is power in a world addicted to oversharing, overreacting, overextending. They may still try to interpret your shift. You changed. You became distant. You're hard to read. No, you became deliberate. You stopped equating availability with kindness. You stopped confusing access with loyalty. You stopped believing you had to earn peace through participation. That's the vault you actually cracked. The belief that you needed permission to disengage. Once that belief dissolved, everything else followed. Now, even if you revisited those old spaces, you wouldn't fit the same way, not because they rejected you, but because you outgrew the version of yourself that tolerated misalignment. Growth like that doesn't announce itself. It rearranges the room quietly. And here's what they still haven't grasped. You didn't expose what they buried by digging it up. You exposed it by thriving without it. You showed that relevance isn't granted by systems. Identity isn't defined by access. Value isn't negotiated through compliance. You redistributed your energy. You reclaimed your attention. You internalized your authority. And once authority is internal, it cannot be revoked. They may continue trying to decode you, trying to map your new behavior using old assumptions. But those assumptions no longer apply. You're not playing the same game. You're not operating from the same incentives. You're not motivated by the same fears. You didn't become unreachable. You became sovereign. And sovereignty doesn't panic. It doesn't rush. It doesn't explain itself endlessly. It moves when aligned. It disengages when necessary. It remains centered regardless of noise. That's why this shift feels permanent. Because it is. You didn't crack their vault to steal secrets. You cracked it by realizing there was nothing inside you needed to survive. And now, you're not reacting. You're not resisting. You're not rebelling. You're building quietly, independently, without seeking permission. And that's what truly makes them uneasy, because a person who no longer requires the system cannot be controlled by it. And once one person proves that, others start noticing.